So about 6 or 7 months ago, I made a video on Rising Zan the Samurai Gunman, a PS1 game that you could arguably call the first character action game. It was a fun little video on a very niche retro game, and I really enjoyed making it. And I was especially fond of the little live action skit that I made for it too. But what I found really odd was the number of comments I got on the video that were absolutely filled with vitriol just for me using the term character action to begin with. There was many people who were confused why I wasn't just calling it a hack and slash, but many others who were very angry at me for not using the term spectacle fighter, a phrase that I dispute and disregard explicitly in the video for very laid out reasons. See, the thesis of the video was, is Rising Zan the Samurai Gunman the first character action game? And since character action is a pretty nebulous term when it comes to genre names, I do go a bit into explaining what I believe character action to be. Like many video game genres, it's one very much based on vibes, and what that means is a lot of the time people aren't really sure what it is unless they're already pretty deep into the genre. And it's a problem and a critique that MetroidVanias, and to lesser an extent immersive sims, also run into. To me, character action is a subgenre that exists within the action genre and can also be applied to others. And it's used to denote the difference between different styles of action gameplay, just like how you can have an action RPG for things like Kingdom Hearts and Ys, or something like a cinematic action game from something like Assassin's Creed, Batman Arkham, or Prince of Persia, for example. And what sets character action apart is the focus on the amount of control you have over your character. And I think the best way of describing what this actually means is by thinking about the game's combat and combo system. The way that I look at the combat of most action games is that you have a sort of phrase book of different phrases that you can apply to any situation where you feel like they're applicable. Some examples are like, is there a heavily armored character? Use slower heavy attacks to break through them. Granted, they don't all follow that rule. A cinematic action game just has you mash square for the most part. But if we continue using this analogy, character action differs from more typical action games, as instead of having a phrase book, you just have a collection of individual single words and maybe small phrases that you can string together to make your own sentences. And this is where the dreaded buzzword of player expression comes into play, but with character action, it very much is the case. The idea behind this subgenre is that you can create your own different custom combos and do whatever the hell you want to be able to get from one end of the game to the other. Hack and slash is a perfectly fine genre name, and I get that it applies to a lot of these games, but fundamentally it is describing a different thing. Meanwhile, there's spectacle fighter, a term that I don't like because it's trying to replace character action whilst failing to fix the problems that it's trying to solve. The idea behind the term is that it's supposed to be a better, more descriptive term for the genre. But spectacle is also a very broad term. The Muso games have a ton of spectacle to them, but they're a lot less like Devil May Cry than something like Super Crush KO, which is honestly quite reserved in comparison. Meanwhile, the fighter part of spectacle fighter has a bit of a legacy within video game genres. We've got things like arena fighters, platform fighters, tag fighters, and these are all variants of the fighting game genre. And language doesn't exist within a bubble, so the term spectacle fighter should imply that it is a variant of fighting games. Now, I'm not super against anything being changed from the term character action. I think pure action and stylish action, while not what I'd use, are perfectly fine terms to describe the genre. I just think it's really strange how many people are very aggressively flying the spectacle fighter flag when it's not even very good at what it's trying to do. And while it's not really part of the topic of this video, the other popular argument as to why we shouldn't use the term character action is that at the end of the day, it just describes really good action games. Now, I can appreciate the fact that the Gaming Brit made this video from a very valid place, as it was a response to the criticism he got from not liking the new God of War games compared to the previous, as well as games like Devil May Cry and Ninja Gaiden. With the argument that fans were making being that you can't criticize and complain about the simplified combat of God of War because it was now a different genre to begin with. But there's two types of problems that arise from this type of thinking. Firstly, it's the idea that character action games are now just automatically better than all other action games, and it does create a sort of sense of character action elitism, even though that's probably the opposite of what the gaming Brit was trying to do. The other problem is that the idea that character action games are just really good action games kind of falls flat when you've got things like Devil May Cry 2, The Initial, and various other character action games that are not very good. Like, if I had to pick between the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Platinum game and Kingdom Hearts 2, I know which one I'm probably picking. But putting this tangent aside for 1 second, why do I dislike terms like spectacle fighter and search action for the Metroidvania genre so much? Because I can certainly appreciate the argument that they're not very good descriptors of the genre because they rely on pre-existing knowledge to be able to understand what they actually mean. Because while I can sit here and break down what a character action game is to you, it still requires me to do that for you to understand what it is without actually playing the games yourself. Meanwhile, people can describe what makes a Metroidvania very easily, but it requires the knowledge of two different video game franchises to be smushed together to be able to understand the name it's been given. The first problem is that unlike movie genres, video game genres kind of suck. Movie genres, for the most part, are indicative to the emotions that you're supposed to feel when watching them. A comedy is something that you laugh at and find comedic. A horror is something that you find horrifying. We categorize the art by the emotion it makes us feel, with the only exceptions being things like noir and new wave, which are more meta descriptions about how the film was made and shot to begin with, which funnily enough is very similar to character action describing the general gameplay philosophy opposed to the actual gameplay style. Because yeah, video game genres don't really describe the emotion that you're supposed to feel when playing them, they're supposed to describe the gameplay style in general. And this is why a video game genre can completely change just by repositioning the camera to a different place. I think we can all agree that Doom is a first-person shooter, but in reality, underneath the hood, it actually looks a little something more like this. It's just that it renders all of this information in a really warped and obscure way. And this is why you can't do so much in the original Doom, like look up or look down or go under bridges, but it's also why it can run on just about everything from a graphic calculator all the way to a pregnancy test. But that doesn't change it from being a first-person shooter in the eyes of just about everyone. An entire video game genre can switch to something else so easily from just a tiny little change. And so many of those changes desperately require context. For example, a genre that's not really contentious in any shape or form I'd say is survival horror, with them being horror games with survival elements such as limited resources in some shape or form. And because the genre is quite popular, that will definitely make sense to you, but to somebody who is completely outside of the gaming sphere, that doesn't actually mean anything. My favourite survival horror is Castlevania because it's got horror elements from movies like Dracula's and Mummies, but also you have to survive until the end of the level. I absolutely agree, we need to stop with this Metroidvania nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. We should call Super Metroid by the genre that it truly is. A third-person shooter. And don't even get me started on all of the games where you play the role of Mario. The truth is that in this case, language is not descriptive but proscriptive. The genre names are only there to give us enough information to infer what it is with the knowledge that we already have. It's why nobody really uses action-adventure anymore unless the game is very broad and generic. But the important part about all of this is that legacy is incredibly important for what a genre name is supposed to be. And the reason why terms like character action and Metroidvania have stuck around is because that's the name we've used. And trying to force a new word into the general consensus's terminology just creates another competing standard. The term spectacle fighter has been around since Ben Yatzie's Devil May Cry 5 review 7 years ago, and it hasn't replaced character action as a term, we just have both of them describing the same thing unsuccessfully. The other real question is, why are we even creating genre names for video games in the first place? Yes, human beings like to categorize things and keep them neat and orderly, but what is the practical use of having these genre names? For me, it's for recommendations. If somebody plays Devil May Cry and their response is, wow, that was really good actually. I've never played anything like that. Have you got any other suggestions? You can go, oh, what did you like about it? And if it was specifically how the game's combat worked out, then you can go, oh, well, that's called character action. If you want, you can look at all of these different character action games. The problem of a genre name not being very descriptive of what it is in of itself is not really going to be much of a problem, because the only people looking for that genre are people who are at least somewhat familiar with it. It's why I think Souls-like has been the term that's stuck around so much opposed to something like, I don't know, corpse runners. Because for so long, From Software were the only people making any good Souls-likes, so they were the people who dominated the genre. So every single person who was giving this style of gameplay a name were doing so after coming from a Souls game and going, oh, I wonder what other games play like this. And even though we're now getting Souls-likes from other companies that are pretty good, it's just a little bit too late, and that legacy has already been put into place. Now, for Metroidvanias, it's a little bit different because the creator of the genre actually has his own name for it, being Search Action. And that gives a lot of the people who want to get rid of Metroidvania a lot of ammunition to try and do so. I mean, after all, if the guy who invented it is saying it should be called this, then obviously we should all agree with him. Except we all know that that isn't really the case, with the example being that the guy who invented the graphics interchange format refers to it as a GIF, when we all know that it's pronounced GIF. The other thing is that we really shouldn't let the Japanese decide on genre names, because they make up new ones every single second of every single day. Like, we all make fun of Kojima going, oh no, Metal Gear Solid isn't a stealth game, it's tactical espionage action. And Death Stranding is the first of its kind, it's a strand game. And then you play it and it's just Delivery Boy Simulator. But the thing is, this isn't one of the weird quirky isms of the Genius Go Jumbo. No, this is something all Japanese game developers do. For example, look at the original Senran Kagura for the 3DS. It's a side-scrolling action game, one may even say a beat-em-up. But if you were to ask the director of the game to define the genre of it, he would tell you that it is a flying-out, enormous breast drama hyper-battle. And that's quite the mouthful. And it's also hard to say. Ultimately, we have to remember death of the author is an important thing, and also just cultural differences means that we're going to have different names for different things. If you were to tell somebody in Japan that you're a fan of shooters, they'd assume that you meant this instead of this. But the other reason why I don't necessarily think we should be using Search Action is because if we want to be really pedantic, Metroid is just an adventure game. I want you to picture a game where you go out and explore an open world, and in the process of doing so, you'll pick up various upgrades and abilities to bolster your offensive, defensive, and traversal capabilities. Maybe you get some new armor, or a bigger health bar, or a new weapon to attack the enemy with. Or maybe you get something that allows you to traverse over wider gaps or across the water. And in doing so, it means that the developers have made a recommended linear path through this mostly open world. That's what the original Metroid is. But it's also what the original Zelda is as well. Literally, the only difference between Zelda 1 and Metroid 1 is a difference in camera perspective. And the only real difference is the emphasis on those traversal abilities. Between the Morph Ball, the Varia Suit, the high jump boots, and various other ones, Metroid has a lot more than just Zelda 1's raft and ladder. You also use those abilities a lot more in just general gameplay. And so Metroidvanias could very easily just be categorized as action adventures like everything else. But it's because of the gameplay philosophy that generates this new subgenre that we use to describe this very specific feeling that we get from playing these types of games. It also means that we don't need to have another game in the action-adventure category. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to make throughout this entire video is that trying to force a change is never going to be successful. Changes in terminology can come around, but they have to happen naturally. Back in the 90s, just about every single first-person shooter was referred to as a Doom clone. And with the rise of console first-person shooters, we started to see games that resembled Doom less and less as they were slowed down to better suit the controller. And because of this, among some other things, we stopped using the term Doom clones and started using FPSs. And it was only until way later down the line when Doom clones basically got their new name in the form of Boomer Shooter. And all of this was a process that happened naturally by accident over about 15 to 20 years. At the end of the day, trying to force everybody to use a new term is never going to work. Even if you are some sort of amazing, motivational, charismatic speaker who convinces so many people to agree with you, at the end of the day, there's always going to be people who don't, or somebody else who can just as easily change people's minds. And we can see this everywhere, from video game genre names to the terminology that we use for re-releases. For me, the difference between a remaster and a remake has always been very easy to differentiate. And yet we see so many people argue online about what is what, and I think partly to blame is the game companies themselves. See, the word remaster actually comes from the music industry. It's the idea of taking the individual recordings of each instrument and the person singing and recompiling them together to make a brand new master copy that you use to put onto all of the various CDs, vinyls, and cassettes that you might be releasing. You're creating a new master copy, so you're remastering it. And realistically, you might redo the drums or something to just touch it up a little bit if you've got a particularly bad recording, but this is why you can release something like a remaster of a Frank Sinatra album several years after he's died. And so when we apply this to video games, I define a remaster as anything from a HD version of the exact same game all the way up to a port to a new engine, providing those original assets are still being used in some shape or form. If you can put footage of the original game and the remaster side by side and overlay them on top of each other, then that's a remaster. If you wanted to, you could break it down into more subcategories, but these are all remasters. As for remakes, these are games that are fundamentally the exact same game as they were originally, but every single one of those assets has been remade from scratch. You can have one-to-one remakes that may even still be using the same underlying code, or you can get complete remakes and rejigger everything from scratch. And finally, we have the sort of sticking point that a lot of people get caught up on, and that is reimaginings. Unfortunately, Paul from marketing isn't going to let Capcom refer to the game as Resident Evil 2 Reimagined, and so we get a lot of confusion at this point. A reimagining is like a remake, but it goes so far that the game that you're playing is unrecognizable compared to the original. It's fundamentally a completely different game, and unlike remasters and remakes, you can't really make the argument that they replace the original, even though a lot of the time remakes and remasters can't replace the original due to various underlying factors. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, each of these definitions very neatly describe what makes each type of re-release what they are. There are admittedly some exceptions where games start to rub up against the edge a little bit. For example, you look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition and you look at these faces and go, oh wow, yeah, that's clearly a one-to-one remake. But then if you take a magnifying glass to certain elements of the games like the NPCs, you realize that actually no, it's just a really, really good remaster, with just a couple of very particular areas that have been remade. And I know one popular argument against all of this is that games like Halo Anniversary or Metroid Prime Remastered that have the same underlying code underneath them aren't really remakes because it is the original game still, and while that is technically true, some of those original assets are still being used, none of that is on the surface, and from an average player's experience, that's not going to be entirely obvious. You also have things like Crisis Core Reunion that, while it is technically running on that same codebase, a lot of the gameplay has been changed, such as the basic attack combo, and new mechanics have even been added. I always found it really strange that the trailers were saying it's more than just a remaster, and I'm like, well, yeah, it's a remake. Now, there are other terms as well, like rebuilds and reboots, whether they be soft or hard, but ultimately, this is what I use for my definitions for just about all of these things. The problem is, it doesn't matter how right or wrong that I am, if I'm trying to force this terminology onto other people, it's never going to work. The last 2 or 3 minutes of this video are basically pointless. If you already agreed with me, then your opinion's just going to be validated, and if you didn't agree with me, then either you're sitting there thinking that I'm an idiot, or you have been convinced, but a fat load of good that's ever going to do, because there's going to be so many more people that haven't been. And I can't physically fight against Paul from marketing at every single video game company using the word remake instead of reimagining because he doesn't think it's going to sell. Ignore that, I guess at the end of the day, the takeaway from all of this is that you probably just shouldn't care so much, but I know human beings love categorizing things and being validated, so it's definitely an uphill battle. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this. This is kind of a return of an old series called Rambling with Craft, where I just talk about things in the games industry at large. Unlike some of the older videos, this one wasn't really scripted. I kind of just wrote out some notes and kind of went from there. So I'm not entirely sure how this is going to turn out, but I figured I could do this every other video and kind of pad out my release schedule a little bit. Either way, did you enjoy this? Would you like to see more? I do have a couple of ideas on stuff that I want to put out, like a response to all of those videos saying gaming just isn't fun anymore, or just throwing my 2 cents in on things like video game difficulty. It's the sort of thing that would probably be better suited for a second channel, but I don't know if that's a good idea or not. And in a similar vein, I'd also really like to do a video talking about my journey trying to learn Japanese and how I've hit every single pitfall I probably could have hit. So if that's interesting to you at all as well, then by all means comment down below and tell me. I'd really like to do it, but I don't know, I'm struggling kind of justifying it when it could end up hurting my channel. Like, I do want to make it, but I don't want to make it that much. Anyway, with that all being said, I'll be seeing you next time, gamers.